Islamabad. Thank you so much for having us today. It is such an honor to be part of your community and join this really fantastic event. Today we're going to be talking about the state of open source. There's so much going on around the world of open source. I'm joined with an expert panel of people who know a lot and participate a lot in open source projects, communities, and otherwise. And so it's going to be a great conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about how we interact with open source. We'll get into a little bit of the licensing conflicts that we see going on, because that is something that everyone should be talking about, how we can manage those, some security aspects, and what we hope the future of open source will look like. So without further ado, let's get into some introductions. My name is Cortney Nickerson. I work for a company called KubeShop. We develop open source tooling with a business model on top of the open source base in order to solve problems for different users in the community, in the Kubernetes space specifically. I also participate in lots of community events. I help organize the Bilbao meetup for Kubernetes Bilbao groups. I work with Nancy sometimes doing advocacy for women in tech. And I love open source. It's how I got started in this space in general. So the first person I actually learned open source from was Michael Cade. So Michael, why don't you introduce yourself?
Uh-oh, so I'm to blame for that, Courtney. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, Michael Cade. I work for a company called Veeam Software. Our focus is around data protection, data management, but my complete focus at the moment is around our cloud native, and open source initiatives. So from an open source initiative, we have a CNCF project that we donated at the back end of last year called Canister. But more importantly, I'm the author, if that's what it could be called, of 90 Days of DevOps, which is really a community incentive around being able to put some structured open source learning together so that we can all learn, have this learning available to us versus having to pay for some learning that we should all have access to, and make it accessible for everyone with a laptop or with a machine. So yeah, that's me.
And you make huge impacts. What's one of the biggest impacts that you're most proud of, Michael?
Without even knowing it, that 90 Days of DevOps having 25,000 stars, which I know stars are a bit of a vanity metric by all accounts, but to know that it's helped at least one person in the community to follow and to have a bit of a structure. Courtney, I know you've used the repo bit, so I know that it's helped at least one person in some areas. I think that's probably, but that wasn't how it set out to be. It wasn't a project that I wanted as many likes as I could possibly get. It was me just making notes and learning in public. And then from there, we've got 3 years worth of content from the community as well. So we have the second year was SME, subject matter experts, talking about their areas, particular around security. And then this recent, so 2024 edition was around, it was 90, it was actually 91 session because it was a leap year. But it was from the community. So everyone in the community participated in that. They delivered a session. There was no repeat sessions, repeat speakers. So I think that whole project is probably the biggest impact. But having that structured learning, open source learning is a passion that I've had way before I even knew what open source was.
Fantastic. And talking about communities that are built in open source, Nancy, tell us about yourself and the community that you built.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I must say that even I learned a lot from 90 Days of DevOps. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. So a little introduction about me. I work at Local Stack. It's an open source project, which is basically working towards improving the cloud developer experience for people out there. And I'm a CNCF ambassador as well. I also founded Women in Cloud Native Community. That's the place where I met amazing people like you, Courtney. And I really love doing a lot of podcast workshops around that. And my journey with open source is something very special because I got to know about tech and a lot of things through open source. and through the mentor. So basically, I can say that I learned computer science and tech because of open source. I remember like I was a student at Google open source project like GSOC. And then I remember like how mentors helped me a lot through each PRs and just giving the blog articles, just giving the technical articles, even telling me how to work on different things. So that's really helpful. And if I can just give back to the community, that means a lot to me. So yeah, that's about me. That's my journey.
No, we'll come back to you to talk a little bit about how to make open source a more equitable and advocate for more women being in it. And on that note, Paula, I'd love an introduction of all of the things that you've done throughout your career, specifically geared toward open source and getting more people involved in tech.
Thank you, Courtney, and it's great to be in the company of these amazing people. My name is Paula Pual. I work for my own self in my own company, Gray Shore Associates. I've been in tech a long time, from the early 80s. I worked at IBM when things were definitely not open. And currently I serve the board of the OpenJS Foundation for the past couple of years, and I am a FINOS, or Open Source and FinTech Ambassador, and I maintain one of their projects. I am also working with the Anita B organization as a co-host and co-chair for the Open Source Day celebration that will be before Grace Hopper in the fall this year. So I just love this community and I'm grateful to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's so great to have everyone. So talking a little bit about your experience at OpenJS and the growing community there, because it is a project that's been around a long time, but is definitely growing. It is not an easy thing to do, and it's based so much on collaboration. Talk to me a little bit about how we can foster more effective collaboration within open source communities and make things more accessible for people to get involved.
Would you like me to take that? I do think that it's shifting, even in recent years when people said, oh, come join the open source community. People were like, well, I'm not a deep coder, and there was this kind of image that you had to sit at the keyboard all day or do it on nights and weekends. And that limits people that may have family obligations or whatnot. So I do think that the message that open source is more than just coding. I'm growing a community around one of the FINOS projects, and it's working with the Linux Foundation to get badging in place. There is technical work as well, but it's, collaborating with people. And it's something that really anyone can do. I think that some of the challenges we'll touch on later are how do you fund people appropriately for that time? How do you support the open source projects that really run the world, since 90% of any given application is open source software. So I think those are the challenges, and the community is evolving. And I think that getting this word out is part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for myself, I was not a coder when I got started in tech at all. And so that really touches home with me. And so many people that I know that have come into this field from other careers previously who were not coders and might still not be, but contribute immense amounts of other types of things and value to communities is great. Nancy, you come across so many people like that in your community. Tell me a little bit about what you do to foster that collaboration and to make your community more accessible.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I must agree with Paula. I mean, like, community is evolving. Like earlier, there was a perception that it's all about code, but it's changing a lot. And for example, I'm leading Tag Environment Sustainability Week this year, which is basically a week where a lot of meetups happen to advocate about the different technology in sustainability. So if I talk about this, I mean, we are basically advocating and creating awareness about the tech and about the sustainability topic. So this is something which requires a lot of non-tech skills like program management, a lot of people, helping us with the social media or maybe the meetup organization. So what I really appreciate is that things are evolving because we keep appreciating each other and respect each other for their work. Because this is somewhere, like I read somewhere in the article, that there's a place for everyone in the tech, and it's important, it's necessary. So this is really nice that basically respecting each other, it's very crucial for this, and then being more approachable and appreciating each other for their work. That how their work is super important, how it fits into that puzzle is really crucial. And I guess like we are already doing that. There's a lot of awareness, like for example, through Women in Cloud Native community as well. I try that we have podcast where we invite a lot of women in tech who are leading different areas, and they can tell their and share their experience, that how is it happening. And every person has the unique journey, and that's just amazing to meet people and see that they have amazing journeys, and all those amazing journeys have a mix of soft skills, tech skills, and they are just, we are able to do it together by respecting each other. So I guess like these are the things which I see happening: a collaboration, respecting each other, appreciating the work. That's making open source a beautiful place. Yeah.
And for you, Michael, you kind of have a community you didn't even mean to have. It's just kind of grown and happened. How have you been able to go ahead and get a handle on that and keep it such an inclusive place?
Yeah, I think a lot of the broader open source community, or any community, is probably like you say, it doesn't always have to come from a developer background, doesn't have to come from even an operations background that is tech background. It can come from literally anywhere. So, and I think the important part of that is the different perspectives that we hear and see. Like, just because I think we should, from a DevOps point of view, learn a programming language, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right way. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. All of that but perspective means that we've got a wider viewpoint of many areas that we probably didn't have a grasp on or an understanding of. And I think then that leads into feedback. So two big things that I've found is that perspective is great, like having different viewpoints, different opinions, and then feedback on, like, after the fact, how do we improve this now? And then that different perspective and feedback feeds into that. And I think going into the 90 Days of DevOps project, I was very much in a bubble when I first started, right? I was just looking at much smarter people than me on YouTube. I was gleaning the information from them. I was taking ideas. I was trying to put them down into a 1, 2, 3 day type scenario to build something. So we got hands-on, because a lot of people like to learn hands-on, even if you're not technical. Again, like just having that practice. People learn in different ways, whether it's reading, whether it's watching. I think the pandemic pushed a lot of people onto the watching way of learning. I'm very addicted to YouTube now, thanks to the pandemic. But then equally, people like to get hands-on, and they wanna make something happen, whether that be writing a bit of code, even if it's the first bit of code that you ever write. Just because you didn't before and you're not a developer doesn't mean that, oh, I can't do that. That doesn't mean that at all. Obviously, we want to be able to encourage people to get hands-on if that's what they want to do, and at least try it, so that again, that's another perspective and a bit of feedback that we can garner from that. So I think overall, my two things that I'm always listening out for and massively using the discussion boards on GitHub is feedback and perspective. Courtney, I know that me and you have spoke, like, what do I do next year for this 90 days? And it's about getting ideas and feedback and perspective off other people, because I'm in my own little, I've got the blinkers on, and maybe what I know is one thing, but maybe there's a better angle, maybe there's a different way to think about things.
No, that's a really good point about how important it is to have diverse communities, right? Because people are bringing very different things into the community from their own experiences. I think one of the most fascinating things that happens, at least for me sometimes, is seeing the disconnect between marketing and developers. And marketing people are like, oh, I really truly want to understand this tech that I'm supposed to be communicating about. And they get involved in a community, and developers are so helpful and so kind, but then the adverse comes back when all of a sudden a developer thinks, oh my gosh, I really want to be able to write a blog post or a tutorial that people are going to respond to, and I don't know how to do this. And that mixture of knowledge makes everything better for everyone. But it's fascinating to watch it happen also, because people don't always realize how difficult somebody else's role is until they're teaching opposite types of talents. So I love that all of your communities very much embrace that. Super important. Moving on into other things, because each one of us have a day job at a company where we make money to pay our own bills and do things. And we've all seen a rise in corporate involvement within open source communities. How can we balance these different interests, both commercial and community, that start to happen and drive development? And what are some pitfalls and opportunities, both, that we should be looking for? Paula, what do you think?
I think about this a lot because the Linux Foundation is a foundation of foundations. So the OpenJS Foundation relies on the services of the Linux Foundation, as does OpenJS, Vinos, others. When I see things happening like license changes and companies acquiring companies that own or have developed a lot of open source, I do think about the Node.js team, and the OpenJS Foundation differentiates between open governance and not open governance and open source. If a large corporation controls it, it starts to be driven by the priorities of that organization. And, you know, I love the fact that Microsoft open sourced .NET Core, but it's largely still regarded as Microsoft-driven technology, and most of the commits are from Microsoft. So that concerns me a little bit, because one of the values, as Michael pointed out, of open source, and Nancy as well, is the diversity of the community that comes together to steer the direction of a product based on the needs of the community. And you can, you know, if you have a need, you can issue a PR and impact the future of that open source project. So I do worry a little bit about over consolidation of open source under large corporate umbrellas, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see if that's a shift that just comes and goes like the tide.
Wait and see how it plays out. And I'm so glad you brought up licensing changes. There's so many debates around this. We've seen so much news about this, as well as acquirements shortly after license changes and whatnot. Michael, what are your thoughts? Because you're very much immersed in this space. You're a technical CTO. You're out there with clients, but you're also running an open source community. You're talking about licensing all the time. Give us your thoughts.
So I think as a community, we also need to look at and get the details right on when these companies make that change. I think if we look, and I'm going to note like the Redis situation, if we look at the Redis situation, the initial maintainer, the first creator of Redis, was nowhere near Redis, or nowhere near Redis today, if that makes sense. So if you just go back and look at the history of what happened to that project, how it was merged into a larger company, as Paula said, and basically then it was manipulated into what it is today or what it's going to be. And I think that's very different. But however, I will say off the back of that, it encourages now Redis replacements in the open source community. We're going to go and build more enhanced, better for 2024 editions of Redis type services. I think it's the same when you look at the HashiCorp situation. Both ends, I think Paula just touched on one. Obviously, there's the current situation that happened last week around the IBM buying HashiCorp. What does that do for the HashiCorp portfolio? But then equally, you've got where they changed from that business source license, from open source to business source license. And what does that actually mean? Because from me as a practitioner, I can still use Terraform. I can still go and use HashiCorp Vault. I can use everything in my home lab, and I can use it to spin up the environments that I need. Now, what I can't do is I can't go and build a company off the back of that then potentially competes or does something commercially that is going to leverage that open source or business source license. But I think you've got to massively look at like, and that's where we formed, or the community formed things like Open Tofu, and I think we have to be. There's a story behind every change that happens, whether it's a good or a bad thing. I think we've just got to, as a community, before we start throwing pitchforks and fire at people, we've got to understand exactly what and why, and have a very grown-up perspective of that as well. And don't get me wrong, I feel like open source at the moment is bustling with lots of options and variations of software. But if you're looking at the maintainer list and they're all from one company, like Paula mentioned, I feel like that, maybe not alarm bells, but if you're going to build a company on top of that using that software, then just be aware that probably is a risk to take. Anything is a risk when it comes to open source and using that. But I like to consider open source is always going to be the building blocks of any enterprise technical stack, whether you're a software developer, software house, software vendor, or whether you're a company just leveraging open source software to get the day job done. Yeah, I think so. I think there's lots. And I think my biggest thing would be, let's read the details. Let's understand why. Because from a practitioner, like I mentioned, it doesn't really change anything. Actually, the Redis license doesn't change. I can still use Redis in my little projects demos as long as I'm not selling it, and I can still use Terraform as long as I'm not selling it. So there's an angle there. There's lots of other areas as well, but I won't.
Could I throw one more wrench into that, and then I'll not let you move on? In the States here, the FTC recently said you can no longer make employees sign non-compete. So if I work at a consultancy, they can't force me to sign a non-compete that when I leave that company, I can't go work for another consultancy. So non-competes are really interesting in this space, because if I worked at, I don't know, Red Hat, could I go off and start my own Linux distro? And it's like, well, now I have to consider whether, it's a business software license, or I'm just a little worried at the back of my mind that some of this might stifle innovation, and especially with the rise of AI and code generation. The big companies are going to be the ones with the legal teams that can go out and sue and this kind of thing. And so I just hoping that it doesn't stifle innovation.
I think that's a really, really strong point, especially stifling innovation with AI. And we can talk a little bit about what we think the future of open source will look like, and I'm sure AI will be part of that. But also, I think it's really an important moment to take a step back and think about people who are just normal everyday users who might come with an idea and they're not even thinking about any of this licensing stuff when they get started. And that would very much be your community, Nancy. You have a community of technologists, people who want to get involved in tech and start to get into usage of open source. But how much do you think they actually consider licensing or know how impactful that can be, depending on how they're using the technology that they have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was gonna point this out. I mean, so being being working at Local Stack and then before at Gitpod, which both of them have been founded as an open source project, and then working with other open source projects, I feel that, I mean, sudden changes to the licensing or sudden changes to the way things are happening with open source project, that definitely break trust, I mean, for the users. And I feel like I have one very good example, which is like Open VSX by Eclipse Foundation. And I mean, throughout their journey, I mean, I remember one blog in which they published about help us sustain us. So they had this clear communication, I mean, where they told that where their, the state of open source project is, and they had it clearly asked for the help by sponsors and by different people. So I feel like sustaining an open source project is tough, but people are using it. I mean, definitely it breaks the trust if suddenly there are different changes. And if someone is, I mean, for the Redis, for example, I guess it affected a lot of people. I mean, a lot of technologists who were using it. Even for the Terraform, a lot of companies. I mean, that's another topic. But yeah, I just want to stress out on this fact that maybe for the open source projects who are making these changes, I understand that it's because of the business things, or it could be any more reasons behind that. But having clear communication between the community, that's something which is definitely required. Yeah, and not sudden shock,
And that's
which happens.
absolutely. I think it's a really good point. And as community members, we need to make sure that we're forcing people to communicate with us when those things happen, which very much circles back to what Michael was saying about as a community and responsibilities of being a community member. You also mentioned security, and so we're going to circle back to that quickly before we tie off with what we think the future of open source will look like. But been what, 6 weeks or maybe 8 since the last big security scare, and that very much was an open source issue, having a maintainer who was just burnt out, not employed by anybody, couldn't handle maintaining the project any longer. And all of a sudden everybody across the industry is just shaking in their boots, realizing how extreme that security issue is, and very much not knowing how many others are out there. Michael, what are your thoughts about this? You work in a security space. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think everything seems to be about security at the moment, whether it's supply chain or like just securing your data. Everything has a security angle to it. There's a branch of security on everything at the moment. But I think just to go back to this, and this is again, I went into detail to understand a bit more about like how did this happen? What's the whole complete story about it before I could make any judgment to it? And I know, Paula, you mentioned just before we came on something important that I'll leave to you to finish up on. But just for those that are not aware of like the XZ vulnerability, I guess is the best way of putting that down, is this could have been incredibly bad for the whole world. Not just that it's not, like the fact that it is open source. I'll let Paula get onto that. I'm trying not to steal that, but
Go ahead.
the fact that this would have been in literally every Linux deployment distribution out there across the world if we hadn't have seen what had happened. Like if one person, and let's just boil this down, is it was just by luck that this person was just benchmarking the tool to understand why it was a little bit slower than it was 3 days ago or however many days ago. If they hadn't have done that, then we would have been no wiser. And then again, to your point, Cortney, how many of these are out there already waiting and lying in wait for bad actors to come and leverage, I guess is the case. But Paula, I think you had a very good take on this and
Yeah.
as to why.
And I did say, I just said that the only reason that this was uncovered and addressed so quickly was because it was open source. So I would say that social engineering or, an actor may be a good actor now within a corporation. And with COVID, and there is a lot of stress and mental challenges from, our COVID experiences. Anyone inside a corporation or in an open source community could suddenly have issues that are maybe undetected. And, if they have the keys to the kingdom, it doesn't really matter if it's open source or not. They could inject bad code. And I think open source software is actually safer because it is in the wild and it can be seen and debugged or diagnosed. Whereas if something like that happened within a closed source product within a large organization, it might go undetected. So I think that there's something about this particular incident that's not unique to open source or more vulnerable to open source, but the awareness of it in the open source community is extremely high right now. And how do you avoid these kinds of social engineering attacks? I know the OpenJS Foundation has spent a lot of time looking into this. So I think open source is actually like ahead of the curve in many ways.
Absolutely fascinating take on how insecure we actually would be if we didn't have open source communities to rely on. And people who speak up, because also huge merit to the person who was benchmarking and then flagged it for the rest of us to be able to take advantage of and start taking notice of. So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up, looking at time as well. What do we think the future of open source is going to look like? Paula, looking to the future, what advancements and innovations do you anticipate within the realm of open source?
I'm kind of doing a Back to the Future take on it, because I mentioned when we met that when I joined IBM as a product developer in the early 80s, I worked with many more women in engineering roles. The A-team devs were led by a woman. And so I do think that during the rise of the Silicon Valley years, we saw an exit of underrepresented groups for various reasons. And I believe it's mostly economic forces. And I do think now with open source and the availability of compute and the availability of communications, we're now seeing a much more diverse interest in supporting and building those communities. So my hope and vision for the future is that it's something for everyone, and you have all types of people, all abilities, and all different kinds of backgrounds, because that makes for a better outcome. So that's my hope and my vision.
And hopefully we're participating in that movement here at KCD Islamabad today. More and more people getting involved from different communities. Michael, what do you think?
So I think open source, as I said before, the building block of enterprise or any company, right? And being able to look at what we can all create out there for in the open is what the innovation path looks like for the future of software. Now, I get that companies need to make money and they need to do what they do to get to where they need to be. But if we look at pretty much any business across the world, they're using something backed by open source. So I would like, instead of these companies like your IBMs, your Red Hats, your HashiCorps, to understand HashiCorp. There's a deeper thing, and we haven't got enough time on there. But I would like businesses, enterprise software vendors, to take a stance on understanding the power of open source, so that we can continue that innovation, that perspective, and keep that building block, or that open source building block there as a way of getting things started and just being fair to it, rather than ultimately gobbling it up and bringing it into an enterprise arena and start charging money for it. Because that would just, and Paula, you said about stifling, I think that's a massive concern, because is there going to be a HashiCorp to buy in 5-10 years time? Like, potentially not. If we stifle open source, that will not happen. But look at what HashiCorp brought to the market. It wasn't just Terraform, it was Vault, it was Waypoint, it was like Boundary. They've got so many different open source projects that make such a big difference across, and I'm just talking about the DevOps landscape rather than a broader technology. So I think that, and then I think it's to continue to grow that perspective and the feedback wheel that we're garnering. And I think it's today's community's job to make sure that we continue that importance of open source into the future.
Absolutely. And Nancy, let's wrap up with you. What do you think the future of communities and open source community involvement is going to look like?
Yeah, so I think that definitely I agree with Paula that there has been a lot of awareness and a lot of participation from a diverse group. What I really want is, like, I see that there are so many smaller open source projects which are still developing, and I see a lot of companies who are making money using those open source projects. I mean, the community version. So what I feel is, like, for open source projects to be sustainable, I feel like there should be more of sponsorship. I mean, from the companies who have been using this. I'm pretty sure that Terraform is something which has been used by a lot of companies. I mean, they have built businesses on top of it, which were really scared, but with what happened with Terraform. So I feel like people should sponsor these open source projects to be more and more sustainable. organization should do that. We should keep interest of all the smaller projects as well, which are really bright, which have bright future. So that's my take on future of open source. And I feel like open source is amazing. It's going to be used in every area of tech and everywhere. I just believe that I'm also looking at what happens. I mean, with all this licensing chaos and the business chaos, like so many companies acquiring open source projects, I'm also waiting and I'm also looking forward to what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. This has been a fascinating talk today. Thank you so much for joining me for this. Hopefully we'll do a second edition and continue the conversation. There's so much to unpack here. But it's been really great. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for